Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us, whether you're here in the room at King Street Center or watching this online later. I'm Natasha Jones, Director of Customer Service for the King County Executive's Office, and this is our 8th Employee Town Hall. It's our very first one, though, here at King Street Center, which is right near the stadiums in Seattle. I always like to say that because not everyone actually knows where King Street Center is, so making that clear. I'm joined today by King County Executive Constantine, Director of our Budget Office, Dwight Dively, and Matias Valenzuela, Director of our Office of Equity and Social Justice. It's a lot of words and titles at one time. So we are going to talk a lot today about the 2017-2018 budget, but we will start with employee engagement because just last year, at the end of 2015, we crunched a bunch of numbers that came out of our employee survey, and we learned a lot in that survey. People did not hold back on what they were thinking and feeling and wanting because that's what we asked them for, and some of the biggest issues that they raised were around leadership visibility and hearing directly from leaders at all levels on some of the big issues that we're facing. So what did you hear? What was your takeaway, I guess, from that mountain of data that was crunched?
Yeah, well, first off, the results were improved considerably from a few years ago, so that was good news. We also got some very, I think, interesting and insightful results about the fact that our employees want to hear from and interact more with their leadership, whether it's division or departmental or whether it's the executive. So be careful what you asked for because you're going to get more of this now. I was really struck by the fact that everything we do starts with listening and talking with employees if we're going to do it well. I've put out 3 videos since the survey, and those are intended to really focus on different aspects of our work around employee engagement, talking about what it means to be an employee at King County. I hope that somebody has gotten a chance to watch them. I want to ask for a show of hands. And we've had the opportunity to attend a handful of departmental all-hands meetings as well to talk about how employee engagement relates to the ability of each department to follow through on its mission and of each employee of that department to really enjoy their work here at King County. And that's important. I mean, it's important for employees to feel engaged and respected and to enjoy their work. I know that's kind of an odd concept. Some of us were not raised with that idea, but the fact is that an employee who is enthusiastic to come to work in the morning, who's engaged, who enjoys working with their coworkers and the stuff they're doing to serve the people is an employee who's going to be able to add more value, to provide the services better, to help think about what we could be doing to be able to provide services better. And that's why I want King County to be a place that supports employees and supports ideas, provides equitable opportunities for advancement, and really treats people, every employee, with respect. This employee town hall is another opportunity, an opportunity for us to gather, although some of us it's virtually, but gather together to discuss the issues that are important to you in the county. And just to underline all of this, it's really important that we continually train ourselves to be able to communicate openly and respectfully and directly so that we can daylight both challenges and opportunities to change the way we work so that we can serve the people better.
I hear lots of feedback from our customers, and sometimes it's complaints, and I always remind myself that a complaint is a good thing because it lets you see where the problems are that you can fix. So it's
and of course, everybody here is a customer too.
That's right.
Right? We always have to remember customers are external, but they're also internal. And when we provide good customer service to our fellow employees, we're making them better able to serve the public.
So we're going to turn to the budget now, and like many things at King County, the experience that you have with a particular issue really depends on what department you're in. So we know that depending on what your department's budget is like, your experience with the budget could vary quite a bit from others. Yeah. So we know that there are some big overarching challenges. Can you walk us through that a little bit, how that looks and why that disparity
Sure.
is?
We can, Dwight, I think, will talk in more detail about budgetary and revenue challenges. But just in this room, we have natural resources and parks. And of course, we have a parks levy. So a good portion of the work that many of you are doing is funded by that property tax levy that has to be renewed periodically. And then there's transportation employees, including transit, and much of transit is funded by a 9/10 sales tax, which has its own challenges, because when times are good, it's pretty good, but as we saw in 2009, when times are bad, it's disastrous. But in our general fund, we rely quite heavily on property tax, and the property tax is limited in this state, as Dwight will explain, to something that's considerably less than what it takes to provide for the basic needs of the people. You are looking at a challenging budget for this year, and the biennial budget that we'll be putting together is going to create even more challenges in a lot of ways. We have spent the last 6 years of my administration and really 15 years since I came to the county cutting, becoming more efficient, finding how to do more with less, and in some areas in the coming 2 years we're going to have to do even more with even less. And that is going to really stretch our ability to continue providing the service that people need. And we'll get a chance to talk a little more about that.
Yeah. So, Dwight, you must get this question quite a bit, because it's hard to reconcile the words challenging budget for King County with our skyline. As the executive mentioned, we see cranes all over. There's new retail popping up. There's mixed-use apartments up above and shops down below. It's like you can't swing an organic hemp bag without hitting a hipster who just moved here for some awesome new job with a startup, or to open a marijuana shop or whatever. So how do you reconcile those two things? Some places are doing really well.
For which we don't get much tax at all, by the way.
Important to note that.
Yeah.
Important to note. So how do we reconcile these things that looks really are deceiving in what we're seeing out and about and what we're hearing here internally in King County?
Sure. So let me start with the overall budget picture, and then let's talk about some revenue issues. So King County has a $9 billion biennial or 2-year budget for this current biennium. We are now starting the process of preparing the budget for the next biennium, which is 2017 and 2018. If you look across the entire budget and not break it down into its components, it all looks fine, because most agencies are actually doing very well. You mentioned transit in good times with sales tax and fare revenue. Transit's finances are in great shape at this point, and we're probably going to be looking at opportunities to add service. Many of you here in the room are from DNRP, and most DNRP agencies either have a dedicated funding source like the Parks Levy, or are rate funded. In other words, they're utilities where we charge for our services, and if we need to adjust those charges, we can do so. So like DNRP budgets are in fine shape, and you can go across other parts of the county government and they're okay too. But we have at least 4 parts of the county's budget that are very challenging as we look ahead, and I'll just go through those very quickly. One that's quite small but very important is our E911 emergency communications system. The way that is funded is by a tax that's a fixed amount on every phone bill. And for a long time that worked out great, because people kept their landline and got 2 or 3 cell phones. And eventually people got smart, got rid of their landline, got down to 1 cell phone, and so that revenue is actually now declining. So that's going to be a problem to figure out how we're going to continue to fund that. A second fund that has a problem, and familiar with some of you in this room, is our roads fund. This is the roads that are in the unincorporated part of the county outside of cities. And because of the limitations of state law, we have very inadequate funding for that. In the near term, we're not looking at any more budget cuts. We've had 10 years of those in roads. But our funding level is something like 1/3 of what we need to just maintain that infrastructure. So that's going to keep crumbling unless we get some help with a different kind of revenue source. Our third fund that has challenges is public health. Public health has about an $11 million accumulated deficit by the end of this year. That's mostly because the federal government has cut funding for public health, and the state government hasn't increased the dollar amount it provides for public health since 2001. And it's kind of hard to live with 16 years of inflation when your revenue doesn't go up. So we're going to have some challenges with public health, both with what's already built up and some further challenges ahead. Our biggest problem, however, is our county general fund, which is the traditional services of a county government, mostly public safety, but also things like elections and property assessment, and the frankly very limited amount of funding we provide from our general fund for human services and public health. That's about a $1.5 billion biennial budget, and we're looking at about a $50 million deficit in that fund, despite the really strong economy. And people look at me like, well, how can that be? There's 4 reasons for that. One of them is that the largest revenue source by far for our general fund is property taxes. And in Washington state, the revenue growth in property taxes is limited to 1% per year. Plus, the cranes that build new construction, we get to add that to the tax base. So that does help some. A lot of you, if you own a home, probably are looking at me like, well, I just got my assessment and it went up 8 or 10%. What's this 1% thing you're telling me? Your assessment doesn't matter. In this state, the revenue growth is constrained to 1% regardless of the value of property. So for our general fund, its largest revenue source by far grows much more slowly than inflation and population growth. That's our first challenge. Second challenge, under state law, we've been able to use a different fund called mental illness and drug dependency to fund some very critical programs, but the state is now forcing those back to the general fund. That adds about an $11 million component to our deficit for the next biennium. Third problem is that we balanced our current budget, the 15-16 budget, with some one-time money that isn't going to come back again. And that creates about a $13 million problem. And then finally, some of our costs, some labor contracts have grown faster than inflation. And when you add all that stuff together, we have about a $50 million problem, despite a very strong economy.
I appreciate you simplifying it that way, because often you hear pundits missing all of those points when they talk about the challenges that we're facing. So despite all of that relatively bad news, you still have some priorities that, there's a saying, you show your priorities through your budgeting and how you spend your money. So given that, and knowing that we've got this budget challenge, what are you prioritizing with the funds that we do have, the funds that are doing well as balancing the ones that are going to need some help or will continue to struggle here over the next couple of years?
Well, I think I'll start with a specific example and then give the broader context. Last year, we discussed the fact that we really had cut our budgets so much that we're only able to respond to problems like in the criminal justice system, for example, respond to crime, respond to addiction or mental illness. To an extent, we weren't setting aside money to be able to invest in preventing those problems before they happened. And working with the University of Washington's Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences, we put together the Best Starts for Kids proposal, which is designed to do exactly that, create a little room for us to be able to start getting ahead of these challenges. The voters approved it overwhelmingly, and one of our projects for this year is creating and executing the implementation plan for Best Starts for Kids, and we're starting with a program to prevent youth and child and youth homelessness, which is a significant problem in our community, and those experiences actually change the wiring of a young child's brain and affect them for the rest of their lives. That really is part of our commitment to equity and social justice, that every child growing up here will have the opportunity to arrive at school ready to learn and graduate and enter adulthood ready to succeed and take advantage of all the opportunity that's around us. And equity and social justice is in fact one of the major priorities that we've identified, as well as the challenge of climate change, the challenge of mobility or the lack of it in our region. And you'll see those two are obviously closely connected, and mobility has a great deal to do with equity and social justice as well. And then this notion of us becoming the best run government, because in all of these areas, one of the ways in which we accomplish our goals is by doing very well at using the resources available and building in mechanisms by which we become better every day at that. So just let me touch briefly on climate. We delivered our climate action plan last year, and it is regarded as one of the finest in the country, and so we will be pushing forward on the implementation steps for that in concert with all of our cities. And then on mobility, just recently we opened the University Link for Sound Transit, and of course King County is the biggest part of Sound Transit. And that is a dramatic increase in capacity, in frequency and reliability of transportation. And now we are moving forward, and I chair Sound Transit as well, with a Sound Transit 3 proposal for this fall's ballot. And that is going to take a great deal of my time and attention over the course of the next 6 months. But it is the way in which this generation can make the investment that is going to allow this region to continue to prosper, and all those kids we want to have get a good start be able to prosper, even as more and more people come here. And the alternative is we're simply going to be crushed under the weight of our own success, unable to move goods, unable to move employees. That is a future that we don't want to leave to those who come after us.
The fascinating thing is I just saw a video from the mid-1970s talking about just this thing, and it was the same issues, but 30-some, 40-some years ago. Yeah. How do we deal with our growth? How do we move people around this area that's constrained by water? So kudos to you on a little bit of forward movement on getting us better than we were 34 years ago.
I mean, clearly, transit is the answer. And I know we have transit employees here, and there's high-capacity transit, there's a transit at the neighborhood level. All of this allows us to move in this very constrained geography we have. If we were going to do the same thing and for 1 million more people using the way we did things in the middle of the 20th century, we would have to pave, all of downtown Seattle and Capitol Hill to move that many cars. And then where would they go? So this is our way to really keep the things we most value and to improve everybody's quality of life.
Among those 4 priorities that you mentioned, I'm pretty sure each of those touches everyone's job in some way. So each person at King County should be able to see a direct line from the work that they do to at least one of those priorities.
And that's, equity and social justice is not an office in the corner somewhere and we check that box. Equity and social justice is everybody's job. Thinking about climate and the impacts that our decisions and services have on climate is everybody's job. Thinking about how we can run this government better is everybody's job. And that's what the employee engagement's about.
So that's a great segue. I'm going to turn to Matias now because equity and social justice is your wheelhouse. So how do you see us advancing equity and social justice within King County, especially given some of the challenges we've heard about budgetarily? Some people might say, well, ESJ, that's a nice to have. That's not a must have, but I know you have a different view of that.
Yeah, I certainly do. So really, equity and social justice, I consider it, and I think we as King County government consider it central to what we do, and central to really being effective and addressing the root causes of issues. It's very much around the issues of whether we're talking about employees and the workforce that we want to create and the culture that we want to create, or really addressing the needs of our communities. It's really central to us being effective, providing the best services, and really creating a strong workforce and a strong community so everybody can thrive and flourish. I think that's what we're aiming to do. We have a number of years already under our belt for in terms of equity and social justice and a lot of learnings, and I think we're really at a point now in which we're using this as an opportunity to see, okay, what works and what doesn't work, and what are the things that we need to expand, and what are the things that we shouldn't continue anymore. And so we've had the luxury to really do a very in-depth process in which we've talked to hundreds of our employees, many of you here, over 100 community organizations, to really get a sense of what they think is working and where the direction that we should be taking. So really, and some of this is guiding the budget process as well in terms of our upcoming strategic plan that we're going to be transmitting to council later on this spring, which lays out some priorities and a roadmap for our future in terms of equity.
You just echoed something that the executive said. You said that we're doing a lot more listening than we've done before. So, people have been in the past used to us coming and telling them what we're going to do without asking them first. So when you went out to the communities, when you went to the various employee groups, what did you hear? And did those things match up? Were you hearing something very different from the public versus what you were hearing from employees, or was there some area of overlap?
There is a lot of overlap, and there's a lot of, which makes it at the end, and some key themes begin to arise, and that's how, we are now developing some of the priorities that we are pushing forward. We produced 2 very thorough reports on both the employee engagement and the community engagement that's available. We did those last year, and really the 3 of the key strategies that arose and that are going to be part of our work moving forward is investing in our employees, investing in community partnerships, and investing upstream and where needs are greatest. And we might think that it's a bit of a luxury, especially as we're hearing about some challenging situations in some departments, to talking about investment. But this is really about prioritizing and what do we want to focus on. And it's also how do we use our human resources plus our financial resources. So thinking about it more comprehensively, and really we're trying to lay a roadmap for years to come as well. So thinking more long picture in that regard. So really moving in those areas. And for example, with employees, we really want to advance some of the strategies that create a workforce and workplace. The executive was referring to this, where we can really have, by focusing especially on the managers and supervisors and some of the skills that they need to be able to really have respect in our workplaces, listening, and create an environment where our employees can truly thrive. And then really in terms of our workforce, we know, and we've been looking at, and then we've heard from our employees that we're more diverse in our lower paid jobs than in the leadership and management positions. So, and at the same time, there's a definite strength to having diversity at all levels of the organization to really be able to serve the needs of our community. So thinking about, and not everybody in the organization has had traditionally, historically, the same level of access to employee development opportunities. So given that we have a very diverse and very talented, even lower paid positions, what are some of those pathways that we can develop? How can we focus on employee development at those levels and have those people advance to more management and leadership positions? And we've already seen some examples of some places where that has happened and been very successful.
That's a great reminder also that equity and social justice is not just an issue of race. Sometimes we've heard that in the trainings where people are like, well, I'm a white woman, or I'm a white guy, or I'm an Asian woman. Those things don't really apply to me, or why should I care about this? So it's about making things equitable in terms of gender, in terms of position and salaries, access to professional development you mentioned. That's the employee part. When we think about how we deliver our services and do our partnerships with the community, what did you hear from the community members about what we could be doing differently? Because we feel like we've been doing an okay job, but I know that they were like,
yeah,
not so much.
That's true. So first, in terms of really the effect on our programs in terms of the overall and for departments and agencies, and it's, again, building on some of the things that our executive was talking about with Best Starts for Kids, is this theme of investing upstream and where the needs are greatest. So what can we do in those areas? We know, for example, investing in children and youth and early childhood development can be extremely important. So getting our whole organization to be really thinking about that. Also, how can we think about kind of the policies and system changes that we can create to expand access to determinants of equity, which really touch all of our employees. We touch many of these determinants in our work, and we know that that's much more effective financially to do at that level kinds of changes than just some of the individual behavior change, which is a lot more costly. So how do we think about those really big drivers that happen? And then really focusing on really prevention instead of treatment as well, and thinking that's an important concept of upstream. So thinking around the criminal justice system, what are the things that we can do in terms of making sure that both youth and adults, stay away from that involvement with the criminal justice system and keep them being productive members of our society. We know that that's really going to give, if we're talking here about budget, that's going to give us, not only from the human perspective, but from the budget perspective, is going to give us a lot more bang for our buck. And just briefly, I think the key theme around the partnerships with communities is that really our partners have been saying that they want us to move away from just kind of the regular outreach and episodic outreach efforts that we sometimes do to really developing more our partnerships that we have with organizations. And at the end, really, how can we think about our role in terms of helping build some of that capacity in the community, because at the end it's organizations and community members and residents want to be able to really succeed
part
on
of
their
it.
own, and that's a much more sustainable thing. So if we can build some more capacity to establish some of those relationships and partnerships to build that capacity in community, we'll all be better off.
Excellent. And we really appreciated them. They were, I would say, unrestrained in their in their feedback to us, but it was really useful to us and a reminder that we have to adjust how we approach the community as well, rather than going to tell something, going to ask and say, here's what we're thinking, what's your take on this, or are we going down the right path? It's always useful to get the input from the folks who are going to be affected by it before we make the decisions rather than afterwards. Let's swing back around to the budget a little bit. Executive Constantine, can you talk, I guess, to employees about what they can do individually, because sometimes it seems like these budget decisions are made over at Dwight's office, that the budget analysts and Dwight and the folks in the finance office for the various departments are the ones who are kind of pulling the levers and making the decisions. For somebody who doesn't have a fancy title behind their name and are wondering what impact can I have on the on the budget or our finances or any of that, what would you recommend for them?
Well, I mean, I hate to sound like a broken record, but it comes back to the individual employee's experience and their ability to innovate and to elevate those new ideas so that they can be implemented. An employee who's been working here for 3 or 5 or 20 years will undoubtedly have identified some ways in which we could be more efficient. And by being more efficient, I mean save time in delivering services. Any time we save is money saved. Any money saved means that we can provide more of that service, because I'm pretty sure there's hardly any part of the government where we are saturating the market and providing all the service that could be provided. That is not our constraint. Demand is not our constraint. Secondly, it's really important for us to understand, for our employees to understand these structural issues that Dwight's talking about. Our revenue structure is antiquated, it's narrow. In the general fund, it relies too heavily on the property tax. And the financial situation is not going to improve. I mean, economically, these are the best of times. And we have a $50 million biennial deficit in the general fund. And when things get bad, it will be much worse. We need our state legislature to act. Cities and counties in the state are creatures of the state. And they decide what our revenue sources are, what our revenue authorities are. And they need to provide us, first of all, they need to stop shifting responsibility from the state to the counties and the cities, which is a neat budget balancing trick that the federal government did to the state. So they learned from the best.
Passing it along.
Yes. But second, they need to provide us the revenue authorities that cities have for providing for their residents, so that we can provide for what's effectively the second largest city in the county, which is unincorporated King County.
When you say provide the same thing, so there are taxes and fees and things that cities can put in place that we just are not allowed to do by the state.
We don't have local area utility tax authority. Every city has utility tax authority. We don't have B&O tax authority. It wouldn't do us much good because there's not a lot of business left in the unincorporated area following our good work on growth management, not a lot of big revenue generating business. But it is critical that we be able to do those basic things like provide enough police protection. And the
Fix our roads.
tax structure now, leaving aside our roads, which is a problem I'll talk about in a second. The tax structure we have now, spread across that vast geography, just does not allow us to do the things that we ought to do. Not bringing things up to urban levels of service, but providing the safety, the health, the mobility that people in the unincorporated area need. Third, regional fund sources. There are a lot of things that we have to fund out of what is essentially our local money that are for all the 2 million people in King County, and in some cases well beyond the county's borders. That courthouse over there, Dwight could talk about the REIT for a while if he wanted, but let's talk about roads. Some of the roads are just very clearly local, but a lot of the roads that run through unincorporated King County are regional roads. They're being used by people going between cities, coming from other counties. It's an awful lot of people using an awful lot of road that's being paid for by not very many remaining unincorporated residents. We don't have a tax structure that's consistent with the Growth Management Act and the governance structure that we have now, and that has to change. That has to change. The legislature has to give us regional fund sources to pay for regional services that we provide, including public health.
Okay. Labor is also a big
Yeah.
part of how we can continue.
Well, a lot of our employees, the vast majority are members of labor organizations. And in this, we are, I think, of one mind and need to speak with one voice in the state capitol. We need to tell our legislators that that this situation is not tenable, that it can't continue. The one Dwight described, the one I described with roads, many of these ways in which we were able to run things just fine 50 years ago don't work anymore. A lot of that's because we've changed the way we draw boundaries. A lot of areas that used to generate tax are now inside cities. But this is not okay. We are able to deliver a lot of service for the money we have. When we're given adequate resources, we can deliver better than just about anybody anywhere. But we are having less and less and less and less every year, and it is not sustainable. It is simply not sustainable. Collectively, we need to join together and make them fix it.
It was an excellent reminder, also, Dwight, that you had about how things that did work fine for 50 years are changing, maybe because of technology. Like, who has a landline? Or very many people in here have a landline. Sometimes I can't even find mine. I can't even remember where I put it, and the batteries go dead. So how we use the things around us that fund the things that we need has changed dramatically in 50 years, and our laws and tax system just have not kept pace. This is a great segue. We're going to show a little video here that shows some of the work that our employees are doing. Our wastewater treatment division, actually, some of the employees there have a thing they call Bright Ideas, and it's empowering the employees down there to find some new ways of doing things, and luckily for us, it's also saving a lot of money.
Well, the Bright Ideas program is a way for wastewater treatment division employees to identify things that they want to improve in the workplace, whether it's save money or improve safety or just make their work easier or more efficient. And it's a program where they can submit those ideas and get management and supervisor action to either implement those ideas and to review them.
Well, my job is I'm a process analyst here at South Plant. And so my job is to always kind of evaluate the processes that are in place. My bright idea was a way to optimize our primary treatment process at South Plant. This had an extra benefit of saving energy. That saved us about $228 a day in electrical costs, as well as around 3,500 kilowatt hours per day in electrical usage.
Well, if an employee sees an area where there's room for improvement or a process that needs to be fixed, they are encouraged to submit the idea on what we call the Bright Ideas Tracker, which is a website that we've created just for the program. And every idea is submitted, it's accounted for, it's assigned a number and a date. The employee is asked to identify what they want to improve and how they think their idea can improve it. And the website then posts the idea for everyone to see.
In the past, when a request was made for things like photographs, invoices, and reports, we had trouble finding all the staff members who responded to emergencies and had this information in various different computers and folders. So my bright idea was bring all this information together on one website that people could enter into remotely and access remotely. Now everybody on the team can upload and organize documents no matter where they're at. Not only does this make our job easier as emergency responders, but we're able to help our customers faster after an emergency.
I mean, the desire to listen to our employees and the thoughts they have about their work and the ideas they have to improve it, I think is shared among all public service employees, and certainly in King County. And a higher level of employee engagement is exactly what we were looking for through this program, and it's one of the benefits we've derived. They come to work every day at Wastewater Treatment Division with a cause, and they believe that their work every day contributes to that cause. And if they find a way to improve how they do their work, then they're encouraged to be a part of the solution.
That's great. I love that video. I love the whole approach because wastewater treatment is not something that seems like sexy and interesting, but it is so important to our quality of life. I love that quote from some person years and years ago who said, "I love paying taxes because with them I buy civilization." That is definitely the way I feel about it. So let's turn back to the budget real quick, Dwight. What are the next steps?
So last Friday, we had our budget kickoff, and we had 100-plus finance managers in the room, and we went through kind of the rules about the biennial budget, talked about the situation of various funds, and laid out our approach to the $50 million problem we have in the general fund. Over the next few months, agencies will be developing their budgets, and they're due to my office on July 1. We have gradually changed the process over the last few years. It used to just be completely mysterious, and stuff would show up on July 1st. It would be the first time we'd seen it. And we look at it and say, "Ooh, wow, what's here?" We really are now doing a much more collaborative process, and we're trying to interact with agencies throughout the spring. And in fact, last time we ended up with 3 or 4 budgets that were basically done in May because we'd already had all the discussions. Believe it or not, we actually have 2 agencies that are basically done now before we even started the budget process because we sat down with them ahead of time. They had some really good ideas. We said, "Great, let's do that." And so other than just the technical details, they're already done. We then will spend July and August working with the executive and the executive office to review budget proposals, to put together the budget. It's really not a budget, it's really like 50 budgets because all of the major funds have their own budget and typically money can't move back and forth across those boundaries. So you're really balancing each budget. You're balancing transit, you're balancing roads, you're balancing solid waste, you're balancing the general fund. And we'll do all of that over those months. And then on September 26th, the executive will go to the county council and deliver his budget speech, and we'll deliver the budget to them. And then their practice is to finish at least the Monday before Thanksgiving, so basically a couple months later. The last few years, because they've had a real efficient process and we've worked together, they've been able to get done a week early. I would hope that to be the case, but given all the complexity we have this time, I'm not sure I can be confident of that.
Okay. All right. Now, let's take some questions here in the room. I believe someone's going to come around with a microphone. If you have a question, raise your hand, and someone will get to you. And while Cameron's doing that, there are no questions, really? Anybody? Anything? If you were having lunch with the exec or with Dwight or with Matias, what would you say? You know, I've always wanted to ask you X.
You wouldn't be on video then.
That's true. Right. Keep it clean, people. Let's keep it clean. Well, while you're thinking of your questions, we did put out a request for a few, and I'll put those to you guys right now. So a senior investigator with the Department of Public Defense sent us one. He said, "Why can't funds be allocated for training investigators and staff on the front lines in Spanish to communicate with our clients and witnesses? I've seen Spanish classes offered downtown during the day, which is something HR is kind of making possible again, but that does no good for staff who have heavy caseloads or don't work anywhere near downtown."
Well, that's a good employee question / suggestion, I guess. When I came into office as executive, I signed an order around translation to executive order to have us push forward as resources were available to begin translating first the most essential and then as many as possible public documents into major languages that are spoken in King County. And both translation and interpretation are critical parts of what we do in one of the most diverse counties in the country. But also, you know, beyond those more formal mechanisms, just the ability to communicate with somebody in their primary language is important. And starting with, I think, making sure that our hiring pools for various jobs are reflective of the entire community. We have to make sure that HR and all of us are putting the effort into casting the net wide, not having artificial barriers to employment requirements that are not relevant to the job, so that we can have a genuinely diverse group of employees that's reflective of the people we're serving, and that will help with this. But also, during the bad times, training was just slashed horribly in order to be able to keep providing direct services, and it's been a long, painful process with these continuing deficits to rebuild that training capacity. HR is helping to provide this during the day. I'm going to go back and talk with them because I think this is a good employee suggestion about finding ways to provide more and provide it at times that employees who work during the day can still take advantage of it.
This is a question that also touches customer service and equity and social justice a lot. Matias and I often get questions either from employees or community members about this same thing. There's a couple things that we usually recommend for people who are looking for translation or interpretation service. You want to touch on that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we have, and it's a great question. I mean, we have over 170 languages in our county. So providing training in one language is great, but then what about the other languages, right? So one of the things that your office and my office have been focusing on is how do we actually focus on language access in a way that everybody is able to have access to interpreters and translation regardless of the language. And this for all employees to have this. So we have expanded access to the language line as well. So and our teams go out and offer some of that training to all departments and programs. So that's a great resource. And even I did notice that this was in public defense, and there are some also kind of legal mandates in terms of in the legal field, also in the health field, and we actually have offices that focus on interpretation in, for example, Superior Court or in public health, because we do want to make sure that as part of providing good service and effective service, it needs to be right, especially in those, because the consequences of it not being right are extremely important. So we've also found for just our regular employees that you being able to make a quick call through the language line is a great way to be able to connect the customers and residents on a really quickly.
If anybody here or who watches this is wondering how that works, so say someone comes to your counter or calls into your office and speaks another language and is struggling to explain what it is they want, most people can tell you in English what language it is that they need. What you can then do is get set up to use the language line, which is a number you dial. You put the person on hold or tell them to wait a minute in your lobby, and you call the language line. It takes about 30 seconds to connect, and you say, I'm calling from King County. You get a code, which we can set up through your business office so that they'll know who to bill, and they charge us. It's this great, we piggyback on a state contract for this, and so we get a great rate on interpreters, and they will find, like an Oromo interpreter, and they'll put them on the line, and you say, I'm with King County, I have a person here, they need help, and you hand the phone or you conference line them in, and they speak to the interpreter in their language, and then the interpreter translates it back to you right in real time. And it's great, and then they just send you a bill for like $7 afterwards. So if you need to get set up on that, call my office, and we'll connect you with the person who does the trainings and can connect you with the person to get it set up through your business office. It's a really great option. Any questions? Anybody think of one here in the room? No. There's one here, Cameron.
I was in the roads department. For 26 years in maybe the golden years as compared to the dark ages they're in now. And I understand the structural problems created by the cap on property tax, on the revenue sources, on electric vehicles taken away from the gas tax and things like that, more fuel-efficient cars. Where do you see this coming out of this doldrums? I mean, it pains me. I know what I'm looking at when I look at unincorporated roads, more so than anybody in this room. And the deferred maintenance cannot go on forever. Where's our way out, and when will that happen?
Well, thanks, Jake. There have actually been some pretty concerted efforts going on now to describe the problem and describe potential solutions. We just completed a roads and bridges task force that met in this very room that came up with a set of recommendations, including the observation that we need to create a regional funding source for roads that are fundamentally regional, whether they're inside or outside of cities, because the commuter trying to get to work doesn't care where the city boundary is, right? And neither does that person's tires. The other task force, which was a region-wide task force impaneled by the Puget Sound Regional Council, was the Transportation Futures Task Force, which also met in this room. And that group came out with its recommendations and, lo and behold, identified many of the same problems, but on a 4-county regional basis, and made a similar recommendation that our old way of raising funds and prioritizing projects no longer works for a metropolitan region that's really many millions of people across 4 counties, and we need new governance mechanisms from the state legislature and authorities so we can take a regional approach to beginning to deal with some of this backlog. Those are really the keys. I mean, you could never raise taxes on the remaining unincorporated residents enough to go back and repair what's already been degraded, to build what needs to be built. Our shortfall in roads is like $400 million a year or something. I mean, it's just astonishing. And so that is a regional scale problem, and it requires a regional scale solution. So those are all being presented to our state leaders, and also I think getting the word out to local leaders across central Puget Sound is going to be critical. So as I said before, we can all speak with one voice.
Any other questions here in the room? There's one here that's coming around there, and then one up here in the front after that.
I have a very similar question, but it's related to public health. I interact with public health on environmental health issues quite a bit, and I know they're constrained for funding, and I'm wondering about the long-term prognosis and how they get out of the hole they're in and what the plans are for moving forward there. Just very similar to the roads question.
So let me distinguish between 2 different parts of public health. So environmental health as a unit, as an organization, is funded almost entirely by fees. So they charge for plumbing inspection, they charge for food permits, those kind of things. So financially, they're fine. They're going to be okay. The traditional public health fund that is mostly supported by taxes and grants is where we have a problem. So that's our health clinics, it's immunizations, it's communicable diseases, it's tuberculosis, it's things like that. And the solution for them is going to have to be some kind of additional revenue source, either that's granted to us locally to impose, or the state stepping up to its responsibility to fund public health adequately. And that's what they said they would do in 2001, and they just haven't done it. So we really have kind of 3 legs of our state ask. One of them is the general fund, one is the roads fund, and one is the public health fund, because in all 3 cases, it's state-imposed limitations that are our problem.
Okay. There's another question here, this gentleman, and then this lady here. Oh,
No, okay, other way around that.
yeah. Well,
So my question is, hearing that we need the state legislature to be responsive to King County's needs if we're going to fix these problems, what are the roadblocks at the state legislature, and do our state legislators that represent the King County area understand our dilemma?
let me just say she is not a plant. We did not request this, but that's a great question. Go ahead.
Delicate issues. Let me see. I mean, I'll try to steer clear of just the, standard partisan speech, although there's a good element of that. I think that most of the King County delegation have been repeatedly schooled in what the challenges are here. And a good number of them are willing to do something about it, though they certainly don't constitute a majority in either house. There are others who just aren't hearing it, and then there are some who would really like to help, but the discipline within their caucus prevents them from stepping out with the kinds of solutions we need. Ultimately, it needs to be our 13,000 employees, our 2 million residents, saying that even if you, state, aren't wanting to make the investments you need to make to ensure continued health and prosperity, we in this region are willing to do that, and we need to, and simply give us the tools and authority to be able to succeed. We also pay how much? A very, very large percentage of state taxes out of this one county. So any investment that they allow us to make in our prosperity is something that's going to benefit every resident of the state of Washington.
Let me just add a couple of maybe slightly naive or optimistic notes to that. One is that last year I spent a lot of time in Olympia talking with legislators, and for the first time I had legislators of both parties, House and Senate, saying, okay, we get that you have a problem. We may not have understood that before, we may not have agreed with you before, but now we get that you have a problem. We can't help you right now, but we'll help you in 2 years, which would be 2017. So we'll see. So I think we've at least now gotten to the point where there's awareness and acceptance of the problem. The other thing is that, frankly, the executive and a lot of his colleagues around the state really worked together effectively as a group of counties. And we weren't always as unified about that. We had some counties say, no, no, everything's fine. Well, it's gotten to the point that no county is saying everything's fine. And so it's not just King County asking now, it's all the counties around the state. And if you spend any time out in some of the more rural counties, the service level is appalling. There are counties where there literally is no sheriff deputy on duty at night. I mean, that's astonishing in a country as rich as ours, in a state as rich as ours, that we are accepting of that level of service. So the fact that the counties are working together, I think, is another good sign.
And it's funny you mentioned the smaller counties. You know, when I started into this several years ago, talking about this untenable situation, a lot of the commissioners in smaller counties would essentially say, we don't want to ask the legislature for this authority. We don't want this authority. We won't use this authority because that's the state's job. And we had already long ago come to the realization that the state was not going to be doing that job anymore, right? And they're now starting to dawn on them that the days of having the legislature step in and fund all their basic services, they're over. And they're going to have to step up on their own.
Thanks for the question. This gentleman in the purple shirt here.
Hi, I had a question that kind of relates to some of the employee engagement survey results that we got. And one that resonated for my group was the questions around, do you have a reasonable workload that enables you to do your best job? And at least with my group, the answer was clearly no. And talking with my peers and other agencies, that's pretty common that everyone's feeling stressed and worked out. Wanted to find out, number one, how that issue is being addressed and what budgetary constraints or trade-offs are considered on, staffing increase requests.
Yeah. That, that was probably my most negative answer when I filled out the survey, right? It's like, what? No. The fact is that a lot of that is a result of the need to cut over time while still trying to provide a high level of service to the people. And depending on the department you're in, clearly there's not going to be money to add a bunch of staff to be able to do the same body of work with more folks. What we need to do is to continue to identify ways we can do this body of work more efficiently so that we can make everybody's workload optimal and achieve that state where people are being their most productive. And by most productive, I don't mean just moving the maximum number of pieces of paper or electrons. I mean bring their whole selves to the job, have the time to think about how work could be done better, being able to maintain their health, arriving every day with a healthy attitude. All those kinds of things require us to make sure that people have a good, it's not, work-life balance is something that's thrown around a lot, but it's even more than that. It's just a healthy work life. And I don't want anybody to be scrambling every day, unable to keep up, and going home feeling like they didn't succeed because they were simply given more work than their current way of working allows them to get done. Do you have anything to add on that other than there's not very much money?
Well, there's not very much money, but let me just elaborate on something you mentioned. We all, I think, have a tendency to just accept procedures that are in place. And one of the things in continuous improvement and lean is to have the employees who have to deal with all that stuff question those. Say, does it really have to be this way? And we've had more and more examples in the last couple of years where finally someone said, well, wait a minute, why is it done this way? And you eventually get to the point that no one knows. Well, it's always been done that way. And we found a lot of examples in things like procurement and accounts payable and that, whereby asking the question and discovering that there isn't a reason it is done that way, that you can come up with a way that's a lot more efficient and saves time for everybody who's involved in the process. And I'll just tell one story on my own office. We were actually in a meeting this morning, and we were talking about how a particular calculation is done. And my staff said, well, we don't know. We inherited this, and the person involved has been here for 20 years. We inherited this formula, and we just keep using it. And clearly generates the wrong result. And so we're like, okay, so now it's time to go back and look at that, and they are looking at that. So that's a silly little example, but it's the kind of thing that as employees, if we question why it is done, we might be able to reduce some of this workload.
That, and I'll just add to that, that does have, it seems like we're not going to be able to do enough of that to really make an impactful difference on people's day-to-day work life. But time and time again, we've had people in like my customer service trainings or people I've talked with in meetings who say, we save so much time. I know in my office we were doing certain processes for processing customer inquiries. And it was taking us hours to do this cutting and pasting back between these databases. And KCIT built us this little solution that let it basically, not to get all technical, sucked it into the right boxes. And so it cut literally 7 to 8 hours a week from the 2 people who were doing that in our office. Over a week, and you add that over a year, that's a lot of time saved. So those are the types of things that we can do, and it really comes back to, are you kidding me? When I have to do something more than like 4 times, I'm like, there's got to be an easy button for this thing, like, come on. So more folks feeling empowered to ask that about processes, especially at the county where we know we're good at keeping things around for a long time, like processes, it will eventually start to have a real impact on our bottom line and on our quality of life, as you mentioned, because it's no fun to, in the day feeling like you've been on a hamster wheel all day and there's more to come the next day.
Unless it's part of healthy incentives.
That's true.
That's
That is count. All right. One more question? Yeah. Oh, way in the back there.
I'm a bus rider, and I'm always surprised waiting for the bus every day, and on the bus I hear conversations from residents talking about government and how much the county must be making from all this ridership on the buses. It's amazing to me how residents of this county, and I assume other counties, don't understand how their government works, don't understand the funding structure and the problems with it. And I'm wondering, wouldn't it be a benefit to try to put out some informational pieces to help get people up to speed on the funding problems so they will call their legislators and hopefully support a change in the funding structure?
Yes.
Exactly.
It's a resource issue and it's a question of who the appropriate messenger is, but this is a problem, as we all know from watching the current political season across America. People have a fundamental lack of understanding of how government works, of the provision of services, of which of these things that they take for granted are a result of a collective decision to raise revenues and spend them in a targeted fashion. And it's frustrating. Sound Transit built in from the start money for marketing and for communicating with people. Metro Transit had to cut most of that in order to just keep the buses on the road. And I think you see that reflected in the numbers when you do research about people's perceptions of agencies. Sound Transit is like off the charts among governments, wildly popular. And I think a lot of it is those commercials with like the, lady with the white wig and all that stuff. And people explaining what it is Sound Transit does and how it improves your quality of life. And we need to be able to do that. We need to say what the challenges are and what these services are and how they are making your life more productive and improving your quality of life.
We're looking for ways to do more of that and to, this may not be okay to say, but to bypass the usual messengers because they don't find it interesting or sexy unless there's something negative.
No offense to our communication people.
Exactly. But it's bad news stories are what's most interesting, or it used to be in news. If it bleeds, it leads, right, was the motto. The stuff that we're doing is not bleeding, it's not, bad stuff, and it's hard to get the news out about the good stuff that we're doing or just the basics of like how things work and what buckets money is in. I wish we did have more outlets that were willing to air that sort of thing, and we'll keep at it, I guess.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to wrap up. Thanks so much. If you still have questions, I just saw one hand shoot up, but we've got to wrap up. Will you email us, and we will get you an answer on that. And this show will be put online, so you can watch it again later if there was something we said that you're like, wait, what was that again? But I want to thank you all for joining us here in the room today, for your questions, and for just working for King County. I think it's a wonderful thing that we have the opportunity to do, and I thank you for doing it with me.
Thanks.